that. So thank you very much. We're actually nearly at 80% of our target, with over 118 different donations coming through. So it's really exciting. We're nearly there. So thanks for those that have donated, and thanks if at the end of this you want to donate again, we would be very happy. But thank you anyway for if you have donated. Much appreciated to that. It's really close. We also we'll have our conference in Scotland. Our summer forum is in Motherwell this year. We still have spaces there if people wish to join us up in Scotland. It'll be different. Hoping from there that we'll have some more events in Scotland, but it's going to be quite a focused and interesting 2 or 3 days up in Motherwell. So again, go onto our website and you'll be able to see that and be able to click on that. So thanks very much for that. Okay, if Luke, if you want to put your thumb up, right, we're good. We're good to go. So tonight's webinar is Luke Barley. Luke is a stunning chap, as you all know. He's one of our trustees. He's the vice chair of ATF and has spent all his career working with ancient and veteran trees as the trees and woodland advisor now in the National Trust. So quite a big and important job in one of the big important organisations looking after many of our trees and veterans. And he's the author of a new book, Ancient: Reviving the Woods That Made Britain. And I'm really looking forward to this. It's an incredible book. If you haven't got your copy, you need one. It's one of those ones that needs to be on the shelf. I think that's enough plugging for Luke's book, but I'm sure he'll plug it some more. But it'll be fantastic to hear his side of the story. So, Luke, over to you.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you for such a kind introduction. And yeah, thank you all for having me here tonight. Thank you, wonderful ATF staff team and colleagues, for inviting me. It's a real privilege. And thank you to all of you for showing an interest in my book and this talk. I really do appreciate it. And as Richard said, I am a trustee of Ancient Tree Forum, which I feel very privileged to be. So thank you also for those of you who have donated to the Big Give. It means a huge amount to the organisation to get those donations that we can get double through that process. So thank you. Okay, so tonight I'm going to talk about my book, also called Ancient, as you know. And before I get started, I'm just going to share my screen. So do bear with me while I do two things at once. That should be coming through. So here we are, some lovely ancient trees. So the book isn't just about ancient trees, it's also about ancient woodland, as I'm going to talk about in a moment. And we are going to sort of talk about both themes, but I'm going to focus a little bit more on ancient trees and ancient wood pasture than I probably would do for another audience. So here I am on the left, that's me in an incredible old ancient lime in the Lake District, one of my favourite tree species, and that is actually one of my favourite individual trees as well. And here's the book on the right. And just before I get into the tree stuff, which is I know what you all came for, I just wanted to tell you a little bit about the process of writing the book and where it came from. So as Richard said, I currently work as an advisor for the National Trust. I've been doing this for about nearly 7 years, which is unbelievable, really.
There we are.
Oh, we've got someone just joined. Would you, everyone, just make sure you're on mute if you wouldn't mind? Sorry, I thought I was doing something wrong then, and someone was telling me. Okay, so yeah, before I was in my current role, I was a ranger for a long time in a variety of amazing ancient woods, mainly in South London, the Lake District and the Peak District, although I've worked in other places as well. And I've always loved reading and I've always loved writing. And I actually studied English and history before I was a ranger. So whenever I had a really memorable day in the woods, or if we were doing something that I thought was particularly memorable to me, or, you know, sensorily rich and interesting, an unusual experience, I wrote journal articles about it. So I had a collection over the years of dozens of essays, really, about days in the woods, and I had this vague aspiration of turning them into a book. And then somehow, don't ask me how, when my youngest son was born and I was on paternity leave, suddenly it all came together in my head, which of those journal articles I should pull together and what the theme was and what the story I wanted to tell was in the vaguest terms about our ancient woodland and our connection to it. And obviously, that was the worst timing you could possibly hope for me to realise I had a book in me. But I also realised I either had to do it now or wait till I was retired. So I won't bore you with the whole process of how I carved out the time, but that's kind of where it came from, was those experiences of me working in the woods. And Ancient is strung together by those descriptions, explanations of the stuff I actually got up to. And I'm not going to talk too much about that today. You'll have to buy the book for that. What I'm going to talk today is some of the history stuff that I use those experiences to talk about. So, as I started writing the book, I did realise that there was a real focus on one endangered woodland species that has been in crashing decline for the last couple of 100 years. It's us. And Ancient really is a human story. It's the story of our interdependence with woodland for millennia and actually deep into evolutionary history. I realized the more I got into writing the book that we are a woodland species. We evolved in woodland, and since at least the Bronze Age, we have been completely interdependent with Britain's woodlands, and we took almost everything we needed from them. And we only lost that connection in this country a couple of 100 years ago with enclosure and the Industrial Revolution. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that long history over the next few minutes. So where I started was where it all began in terms of what we think of as active woodland management. And it all began just under 7,000 years ago, as far as we understand it, with the Sweet Track and presumably lots of other infrastructure like this around the country. So the Sweet Track is this raised walkway in the Somerset Levels, and this thing, the photo on the right, is a replica. It's not the real deal. The real deal is preserved in the peat, and it was excavated by archaeologists in the 1970s. And they carbon dated this walkway to just before the Bronze Age. So yes, just under 7,000 years ago. And everyone's interpretation of the Sweet Track is that it's made from coppiced wood. Those round poles that form the stakes that hold it in the ground are from coppice. That's what everyone thinks. So this is our earliest evidence of coppicing, and it's our earliest evidence of people actually tending the woods. And from that point forth, we only became more reliant on woodland for 5 millennia, really. And lots of you will know about all the different things we relied on from the woods. I knew about lots of these things because I've been interested in ancient woodland and woodland crafts my whole career. What I think I didn't quite realise quite so profoundly until I started writing was just how dependent we were on this stuff and how many different things we took from the woods. So we all know about lots of these wood products. Down on the bottom left there, we've got spoons. And people often call this kind of thing the treen, the stuff of the trees, all the little bits and bobs we needed: spoons, crockery, pegs, boxes, cups, you name it, it was made from wood for 5 millennia. Baskets, top left there. Over on the right, that small diameter coppice material that went into wattle and daub walls. It was the wattle that was then daubed with that mixture of mud and manure and everything else. And wattle was also used to make hurdles, as many of you will know, fish traps. I was amazed to discover in reading Rackham, who was obviously really important to the writing of this book, that a woven fish trap that again was found in a peat bog down in an estuary in the east of England was one of the biggest wooden structures ever made in this country. So I was thinking of fish traps as these sort of, little football goal type things, one of the biggest structures ever made in this country from wood. And I think the level of sophistication, though, that our ancestors had in their use of wood is best illustrated by a cartwheel. And as lots of you will already know, every different bit of a cartwheel is made from a different species of wood that has the properties that that particular component needs. So the hub of the wheel in the center was of elm, which wouldn't split even when it had the spokes driven into it. The spokes were typically oak because they could stand the particular strains and stresses that they were under. And the fellies, which is the bit around the wheel, were made of ash, and that had a slight spring to it, as lots of you will know, and gave a very, very subtle form of suspension. And then the brake blocks were black poplar, which could stand the heat from the friction. So yeah, an incredible level of sophistication. Firewood, again, we all know this, don't we? Everyone used firewood. Well, of course they did. And then I thought about the actual implications of that everybody was involved in this process of planning months and years into the future to ensure that they had the firewood they needed. And in the 17th century, I can't remember the gentleman's name, to my shame. I read a brilliant academic paper by an expert on historic use of energy. And he showed that in England and Wales in the 17th century, we needed more than 1 million tons of firewood each year. But that was only the produce of a couple of 100,000 hectares of woodland in sustainable management. So there was still a heck of a lot more woodland for all those other things we needed. But it just goes to illustrate how dependent we were on firewood. And then this picture on the right, this is people smelting iron. And what this illustrates is the importance of charcoal. So again, we were completely dependent on charcoal, really. Charcoal underpinned so many other really key technical innovations. So without charcoal, there is basically no smelting metals because it burns with that fierce, steady heat that smelting needs and that isn't provided by firewood. And again, I was just amazed to be forced to think in real terms about how much charcoal we needed and how significant its production at mass industrial scales was to the course of our history and the way history developed. And then, of course, above the coppice, we've got the timber trees. And I really loved finding out about the work they're doing at Notre Dame. This photograph on the right is one of my favourites in this whole presentation, actually. And they've roped in some carpenters who are building a medieval castle from scratch elsewhere in France using contemporary techniques to advise and support the reconstruction of the roof, which had been up there. Obviously, that oak had been sitting up there since the 13th century before it burned. And in reconstructing it, they needed more than 1,000 oak beams from, the equivalent of our standard trees of at least 25 meters in length. Now, lots of you will know that we would be hard pressed to find a quality oak beam of 25 meters in length in the UK today, a single one, let alone 1,000. And obviously that does illustrate the fact that France still has a sort of booming oak industry that we've lost. But this also illustrates what's going on above all our cathedrals. All of them have got this much oak sat up there. And I had a really brilliant trip up the Lantern at Ely Cathedral, which was considered one of the wonders of the medieval world. And nobody really understands how the huge oak beams in there are actually suspended above the rest of the church. It's an extraordinary place. And you can see the same at Salisbury Cathedral, as lots of you will know. And it's really worth a trip to try to get your head into gear of just how much wood we were producing sustainably from what became what we think of now as our ancient woods. I love this as well. This is a really nice project in northern Spain where they're recreating a medieval ship, which again just goes to illustrate the amount of oak that went into boat building. And again, We kind of know about this, don't we? Everybody, it's well known about the hearts of oak of the British Navy and Nelson and his fleet, and how that referred to the men and the ships. And there was a period of 200 or 300 years where a huge amount of oak went into wooden ships. And I love this picture on the right in particular because it illustrates the use of natural curves so well. So here are the guys from the project in northern Spain looking for the right curves to form the futtocks, the ribs of their ship. And this is what happened throughout history. So the woodsmen and the woodwrights would find the correct curves existing naturally in the trees to suit the needs they had, whether that was for crook barns, holding up huge medieval tithe barns, or for ships like this. And we think that in some places they did train the trees as well. And there's evidence of that in northern Spain. There's evidence of it as well from places like Kingston Lacey in the south of England. And we've completely lost that use of what's sometimes called knee timber today. But I'm going to come back to that later when I think about the future of our ancient woods. But just a lovely illustration from northern Spain of what would have been, again, a mass industry in many of our oak woods. And wood pasture. Lots of you will know about wood pasture, being ancient tree people. And I knew about wood pasture because I'm an ancient tree person. I've worked on lots of wood pasture sites and think about its ecological restoration. And I was also sort of, aware enough that pollards are another cultural artifact, a lot like coppicing. Obviously, they've been cut by people for centuries until the Industrial Revolution. But again, what writing the book brought home to me was just how important wood pasture was, to almost everyone. If we consider the fact that nearly everyone, all our ancestors before the Industrial Revolution, lived off the land, urban populations were very small, almost everyone relied on wood pasture in one form or another. And one of the confusing things in writing about wood pasture is it is really hard to get to the bottom of how much wood pasture there was, even from reading different Oliver Rackham books, different George Petercam books, other people, trying to think of his name, the Welsh historian William Leonard. Everyone's got a different view on it. But what seems really clear is that, as George Petercam writes, wood pasture was everywhere. Wooded commons were everywhere. Common land was everywhere, and it was typically dotted with pollards. It was incredibly important to almost everyone, which I found so fascinating that almost all our ancestors had that relationship with cutting trees and with grazing animals and with everything else they took from wood pasture landscapes. And it wasn't until the enclosure movement that began to end. And now again, I was really, really interested to learn more about enclosure, which I knew a little bit about. So for those of you who've not come across this is basically the process of common land where everybody had the right to take the things from the land near where they lived that they needed. It's the process of that common land being privatized and the person who owned the land being able to convert it to, whatever purposes brought them most profit. So typically wooded commons like the one in this picture were privatized and they were turned into either, monocultural agricultural fields or sometimes monocultural coppice woods, or as time went on through the 19th century, sometimes into forestry plantations. And this happened at enormous scale. More than half of England was common land that was privatized during enclosure, and it severed our ancestors' relationship with the land. And that's when lots of people then had to either work as farmhands in support of the landlords, in the service of the landlords, or go into the cities and work in the new industries, in the mills and factories, which were also developing at the same time. And it really got me thinking that actually the Highland clearances are still felt in Scotland as this great injustice. Enclosure feels just too long ago in England that we don't feel that sense of injustice, but maybe we should, because I really began to feel that enclosure and our uniquely intense experience of industrialisation in England, in particular, also Wales and Scotland to a degree, has led to both our uniquely severe disconnection from nature as people, and also the fact that nature in England is uniquely affected in comparison to most of Europe. We're one of the most nature depleted countries in Europe. And I think we can trace both those factors back to industrialization and enclosure. But I also had the very great pleasure of exploring in the book like the amazing value in restoring wood pasture landscapes, and I explore why wood pasture and why well-managed coppice woodland is so good for nature. For instance, spoiler alert, lots of you will know this, it's because it replicates in lots of ways the pre-agricultural landscape, the wildwood, as Rackham described it. We often talk about the Vera hypothesis, and Vera described this dynamic mosaic of mature trees, scrub, open habitats, all changing over time. And that's where the real magic is for nature, in that combination of habitats. And that's probably what existed before farming, and processes were driven by wild grazing herbivores, giant aurochs, the predecessor of the cow, giant rhinoceroses and stuff, even further back in time, hairy elephants. And that was where all our species evolved. So in managing wooded commons like this one at Croft Castle, in managing coppice woodland, even though our ancestors were doing it for the things they needed, they were replicating the conditions that lots of wildlife needed. So it was lovely to be able to explore that and think about all those connections and what that means for our management of coppice woodland, other forms of management of woodland as well. I do talk a lot about continuous cover forestry, and that coppicing isn't the only way to go to manage our woods for nature, but wood pasture as well. And I love this picture because there is a freshly pollarded tree cut by Jamie Simpson, if any of you know him, and a pollarded tree that's probably a year or two after being cut, as well as the ancient oaks. So we've got probably, you know, the closest analogy to a medieval wooded common we're likely to see happening at Croft Castle, thanks to Ian Carter, the old countryside manager there, and to Jamie's work, which is really, really lovely. But wood pasture isn't just about nature. It is deeply ingrained in the human psyche, not just because of that cultural heritage. And I'm just going to take the liberty of just doing one short reading. I'm going to spare you too many of these, just this one. But I did want to read one bit of the book out to you. And this is from a chapter when I've been talking about the natural history of wood pasture and the links to the wildwood and why wood pasture is so rich in wildlife. But at this point, I've come down from pruning an ancient oak, which I was really lucky to be able to do at Ashted Common earlier in my career. And I'm sat in the top of the bolling. While I know in my rational mind that this restored landscape will be better for nature, there's also simply something in my heart that likes it, whether I'm gazing out from the top of an ancient bolling or walking among the willow scrub of the lower common. Humans have been called a species of the woodland edge, but what this recognises is that we too are a wood pasture species. The varied woody landscape of a restored Ashted Common echoes both the landscape in which we first evolved in Africa's savannah and the wider landscape in which we came to survive as we moved north and began our slow colonisation of the European wildwood. Forest scientist and writer David George Haskell explains that an affinity for savanna-like landscapes is one of the neurological quirks that we humans have carried with us as we spread across the world. Wood pasture has been home for people in Britain since our earliest history as hunter-gatherers, through the time out of mind in which customs of communal use developed, and into the long period of formal common rights. And it only stopped being home when the Industrial Revolution and enclosure broke our deep connection with the land. So just to labour the point a little bit more, just to show you a couple of charts about our evolutionary history, as David George Haskell writes, you know, our connection to wood pasture goes back a lot longer even than the Bronze Age and when we began to tend the woods. So here we have a timeline of human beings, as you can see. Here we are. We started to control fire 500,000 years ago. Modern humans came along a couple of 100,000 years ago. And we only began farming and looking after the woods, you know, very recently, as we've said, in this country about 7,000 years ago. So we were living in woody habitats for that whole period. So it's no wonder we feel at home there. And likewise, even within the historic period, you can see I've called it the Wood Age after Roland Enos's brilliant book on our uses of wood during the last 5,000 years. Here's the sweet track being built. Here's, you know, the year zero, and you can see that we only stopped managing the woods and then experienced what Oliver Rackham called the locust years for our ancient woodlands when they were in complete neglect and decline after the Second World War. It is a blink of an eye in terms of our history on this planet. So it's no wonder that there are studies that show that if we are surrounded by wood products and we can see the grain, like I'm lucky enough to do in my shed, come sauna type office space, we feel much better. When we're out in the woods, we feel better. You know, forest bathing hasn't been invented recently. It's just explained our evolutionary history, really, and helped us to re-engage with that experience of being in the woods, which is where we are meant to be at home. But as many of you will know, when that disconnect happened from the Industrial Revolution on, and then particularly after the Second World War, all our ancient woods and wood pasture fell into neglect. And in becoming more monocultural, darker, shadier, less varied, woodland wildlife crashed. So as I said, you know, our ancestors were unwittingly replicating the right conditions in which all woodland species evolved, basically, for thousands of years. And then that stopped, but again, only in the last 100 or a couple of 100 years. And you can see here just a depressing graph about the decline of woodland birds. You'll know these stories. I'm not going to go through all the different groups that are declining in our neglected woodlands. So what we need to do now is restore our connection to woodland. And we need to restore the management of our woods and wood pasture to make sure that they're as good for nature as they can be, considering we are in a global nature crisis. But how will we do that? We also need to restore our human connection, because none of the charities like the National Trust, who I work for, or the Woodland Trust or the RSPB or anyone else can afford to do this just for nature's benefit. Very sadly, we would love to. But I think there is even greater benefit if we can restore the woods because we've renewed our human connection and we're taking other things from them as well that benefit us. And that might be the well-being benefits of working in the woods, like this great crew. This is Leeds Coppice Co-op, a really great social enterprise managing woods for nature in Leeds, fairly obviously. Or whether it's taking new products from the woods. And I was actually really excited about some of the ideas I came across where we could start to take timber from ancient woods to drive its management for nature and for all its other benefits, but where we can do so at scale. You know, frankly, as much as I absolutely love the coppice crafts, whether it's bodging chairs or whittling spoons or all of that stuff, I love it. We're never going to do it at the scale we need to drive the management that our woods need. On the left here, however, we have a 7-story office block in London made from laminated beech. And this beech came from Germany. There's no reason this shouldn't come from trees from ancient woods in the southeast of England. So how can we join up these innovative architects and engineers with the best woodland managers so that we're driving the economic management of our ancient woods? Likewise, top right here, this is at the Architectural Association's Hook Park campus. It's their woodland campus in Dorset. And they've made this roof structure out of wonky wood, the knee timber that used to be used for crooks of barns and the futtocks of ships. But they didn't figure this all out by hand. They used computer modeling to scan each of the bits of timber and show how it would all fit together best into a structural design. But they figured it all out really efficiently using new technology. And there's loads of really exciting new technologies out there that could help us use less straight uniform timber. So that isn't to say we need to rush into all our ancient woods. I was also really conscious of the fact that if we take the harvesters and forwarders in, we can wreck the soil, which is one of the most important things about them. As I talk about, I've got a whole chapter in the book about ancient woodland soil, which is so important. But that said, I do think that we should be looking for innovative ways to drive more of the management that our woods desperately need. So this is essentially a hopeful story, my book. It's all about how we lost that, I suppose our long-term connection with woodland, how we lost that connection, but how we might restore it and regain it. And I also think about how we can take the lessons from the history of our ancient woods and our relationship with them to think about our use of land more widely. And Wendell Berry, who's a great American agrarian writer who some of you will know, talks about respecting the limits of the land and encouraging and supporting its processes, which I think is what we did in the ancient woods for thousands of years. And if we can take some of that philosophy to our wider use of land, then maybe we could be a little bit more hopeful about the future of humanity and all the species that depend on the natural world around us. So I do hope some of you will read the book, but what I hope most of all is that we can collectively have some influence in driving more management of our ancient woods and more sustainable use of land more broadly. Thank you so much again for coming, and we do have plenty of time for questions and discussion.
Luke, thank you very much, Luke, for such an interesting and huge insight into our relationship with woods and wood itself. I'm sure all of us on the call have an appreciation for that. Otherwise, in some respects, we wouldn't be here listening to you if we didn't. But what I think you've done is just remind us and has brought home that connection we have with woodlands and that I can't agree more. That disconnection of nature is a really interesting and strong viewpoint. That movement away from knowing where our sort of lifeblood comes from is a real negative for us, really. I'm lucky enough, as you know, to have created or overseen the creation of over 15,000 hectares of new nature reserves, mostly wetlands. And I love landscapes. I love wetlands. But the thing that makes the hair stand on the back of my neck and gives you that tingle is when you're in a wood pasture or on the edge of a woodland and you go in and you see some of those majestic pollards and knowing that someone has managed that and crafted that over the sort of millennia, as you say, that's what gives you a real spin. And the woodlands we have and the woodlands that you manage and look after do give us that kick and that spin. Just one more thing before I introduce Helen. Interestingly, in Norwich, as you know, in this country, you couldn't build Roman Catholic buildings until the 1830s, and the second cathedral in Norwich is a Roman Catholic cathedral, and it was one of the first flat pack cathedrals. All the wood came from Estonia and Latvia. It all came into King's Lynn. It was brought down by boats, by horse and cart to a place called Earlham Road, which is a big road in Norwich that leads up to the cathedral. And that whole road turned into a massive wood carpentry and an employment section of in the 1830s. And they put together the cathedral. They took it up to the top, put it up by huge cranes. And if you walk through the rafters of the St. John's Cathedral, it's all Latvian pine rather than oak, as it were.
Right.
But the smell and the structure was wonderful, and all that craft that had gone in that, and we still had it in the 1830s, and it's now very sporadic. I'm not so sure we could do it instantly again, even in that sort of thing.
No.
I'll hand over to Helen now. Helen is, as you know, is part of ATF, but also an enormous knowledge of woodland species, working in Epping, etc. And Helen, I think you're going to work with some questions and chat to Luke and give your perspective of that as well. So over to you, Helen.
Thank you, Richard. I think also if we can open the chat, and then if people have got any questions, please put them in the chat, and we'll try and field them as we go. But thank you, Luke. That was really interesting, and I particularly appreciated you sharing with us how you actually managed to do the writing and sharing. I suppose collecting the information. I was wondering as I was reading the book how you had such a phenomenal memory for some of those experiences. And now I know that you were obviously writing them down at the time, which makes a lot of sense, but amazing foresight to actually think about doing that at the time. So I think we're all really grateful for that. While we've got in the chat some places where you can buy Luke's book, but so do put your questions for Luke in there. One of the things I wanted to, I'm glad you spent a lot of time talking about old woodland crafts and how we're sort of undervaluing some of that at the moment. Actually, interestingly, there was a just a short article on Radio 4 the other day about the fact that thatching spars now are coming from Eastern Europe, and why on earth are we having to buy thatching spars in from other countries when we've got plenty of crafts and wood that we could be producing them. I think one of the other things that I felt really came over in your text was actually how the sort of personal connections come up and the insights you get from actually working in the woodland yourself. And that was some of the bits I really enjoyed, was your sort of personal experience. So I don't know whether you've got any more comments to share about that, about your the closeness that you can get to woodland and woodland crafts by actually doing it yourself.
Yeah, gosh. So I'll tell you what was interesting about writing down these personal experiences was that obviously I'm basically in an office job now. So it was very nostalgic for me to be writing about these woodland experiences, and I think one of the reasons I wrote about them was because I knew at the time that they were going to be special to me for the rest of my life. And, they were some of the best and most interesting things I've ever done, and sensorially rich. And I always think that, the last 7 years of an office job sat here in front of video calls has passed by in a flash. Whereas actually I can remember countless individual days out in the woods. So important to be out there. And if anything, it did just make me think, actually, if I could afford to, I need to jack this in and get back on the tools, quite frankly, because I really think it was a lot better for me. What was I going to say? But the one thing that I would take away most strongly from my personal experiences, and especially as I thought more about it, was that connection with our ancestors. And, I used to love that when we were at Ashted Common and the little crew of us pruning the pollards would think about who cut this tree last. What was their day like? Were they having fun, or was it just a real drag? What did they have for their lunch? And I think you can read that story of hundreds of years of woodmanship in those individual trees, whether it's coppice or pollards, and then you can get a sense of that if you're involved with it yourself, which I really, really love. Yeah.
We've had one question that sort of relates to that, about how can we encourage more people to manage younger woods appropriately in order to create our future ancient woodlands?
Really interesting. So this is where we stray into my very nerdy territory from my current day job, where I am quite involved with woodland creation as well as the management of ancient woods. And so I would like to think, I think there's the opportunity, I suppose, if we do really innovate in terms of new technology and the use of wood, not just for firewood, to create more of a market for first thinnings and early thinning of wood, and to really build that market for good woodland management. Even if that's the things like thinking about some of the other technologies that I learned about, breaking wood down chemically to extract the cellulose and the lignin and turning that into fibre. First thinnings of a new wood are perfect for that. But then the other thing that we do think a lot about in the National Trust at the moment is future proofing our woodland creation so that it isn't reliant on management, frankly. even if rangers in 15 or 40 or 100 years don't come back to it for whatever reason, there'll be some structural diversity and some complexity to it, and how we can build that in from the outset rather than just planting those serried ranks of plastic tubes and relying on people to come back and thin them really nicely. So I think a bit of both for me.
I think one of the other things associated with that is trying to get young people out into the woodlands and actually managing the woodlands and having fun and building dens and doing all of those things, climbing trees, all those things that you obviously did as a child. So it's making sure that people have that opportunity, which is also challenging, isn't it?
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, absolutely. It is. It's the whole system change of how we reconnect. We talk a lot about rebuilding a woodland culture, which again, we were a woodland culture until a couple of 100 years ago, and how can we restore that in every aspect of our life, from nursery school through to the fuel we use and the products we use, the whole system. It's all there.
We've had, I mean, it was interesting that you touched on soils a bit when you were talking, and we've had a question from somebody who said they were speaking recently with a very innovative microbiologist who was explaining how it might be possible to recruit the microbiome of ancient woodland soils, encourage them to reproduce in captivity and relocate them to needy soils. Any comments?
Again, we are deeply nerdy into this in the day job at the moment, and actually it is the Wild West, if I'm really honest. So there are companies out there who sell British mycorrhizae in powdered form, and claim that they've got evidence that this supports the colonization of new trees, for instance, or helps planted trees establish better. But then we've got other mycologists saying the spores are out there anyway, and if you plant a tree, it's probably already got a load of mycorrhizae that were on the wind in it anyway, and they're going to get into your soils. So we don't really understand how that process might work in helping our depleted agricultural soils become more like rich ancient woodland soils. But yeah, we definitely need to learn more about it and take the kind of low risk, no regrets actions we can to support that process.
I think one of the other things that's really, really important is looking after the soils we've got in our ancient woodlands, and that was another thing that you did quite strongly in the book, which I was really pleased to see. We've got some horrible examples near us of ancient woodland soils that have been wrecked by forestry machinery, and quite challenging to get that message over to people. I think one of the other things that you flagged up was, we want things like wild boar that are actually turning over the soils, and it's that contrast between seeing a little bit of disturbance as being good, but a lot of disturbance as not good, and the level of disturbance is interesting.
Yeah, and I do think I think that's going to be one of our big tensions over the next few years, actually, because the need to restore plantations on ancient woodland sites is becoming quite mainstream, actually, and it's not controversial for us to talk to government and people about it. Really the only controversy is how we're going to fund it. But if we're not careful, the default approach will be to wade in with the harvesters and forwarders, because we're cutting conifer, and that's what we do with conifer anywhere else. And that's no good for our ancient woods in lots of places. So yeah, we're going to have to think really hard about how we find that extra money, extra resource to do it appropriately. Because I do think a positive note, I think, is that we will see NT, the Woodland Trust and others scale up their pause restoration over the next few years in a really positive way.
Good. We've had a question about climate change, about how might climate change affect woodland management in terms of things like pollarding. So if trees are more vulnerable and less resilient, they might not be able to regenerate so well after pollarding. And I guess that's true of coppicing as well.
Really interesting. I have to say, I've not seen any evidence on the potential impacts of climate change on coppicing and pollarding. I have to say, I suspect that most trees will be okay because of the strength of their existing root systems. But obviously with oak, when we pollard oaks now, as some of you will know, oak powdery mildew can be an issue on the regrowth. So one of the things we've learned the hard way, and people like you, Helen, and your colleagues at Burnham, is that we don't pollard hard we typically take off sort of no more than a third of the canopy in any one go. So we've always got loads of foliage still there to keep the tree growing as it supports some new growth. So I'd like to think that will be a lesser risk of climate change. But as I say, I've not seen any evidence, any studies on that at all. So that's a really interesting point, actually. Thank you.
Yeah, and a related one about should we be introducing other species of oak, for example, from Southern Europe that are more suited to drought conditions. Yeah.
How long have you got? Yeah, I mean, we unpack this one at impossible length at work at the moment. So I have to say, so I've got a clear view, if I'm really honest, which is that in our ancient woods, we should not be introducing species that aren't site native at the moment. British tree species are really resilient. As in terms of populations rather than individuals, they have been responding to a changing climate for a long time. So what we need to do is we need to get the deer numbers under control. We need to get the thinning right. We need to get the any livestock encroachment down so that the woods can regenerate naturally themselves. And then they should be resilient in the face of climate change, because sexual reproduction will mean that the new generation of trees are more tolerant to that changing climate. So the answer isn't about planting non-native species everywhere. That said, I am forced to admit that we do have a really limited stock of canopy trees native to this country. So more widely, maybe away from the ancient woods, away from those places where nature restoration is our primary objective, then probably we do need to be thinking about a wider range of trees, but in a really careful and considered way. And this idea that our climate is going to be Mediterranean in a few decades is nonsense. It's going to be a lot more complicated than that. So I think this polarized debate is not helpful at all. But I do think we should have some faith in the ability of our native species to respond, but we do need to help them in terms of good woodland management. You're welcome. I'd be interested in your view on that, Helen. We've never spoken about that yet.
No, I mean, one of the things that I always think about is some of our very old trees have been through changes in climate, not maybe the speed and the extent that it's likely to happen, but actually a lot of them have been through quite a lot. So, and I think some of your examples of lime, just completely falling apart and then growing back up again, even if they're not seeding, there's ways that trees can regenerate, aren't there, with just some of the various strategies that they have to enable them to do things like that. So absolutely. I think it's also what worries me is, what happens if the Gulf Stream stops? We're going to be in a completely different climate scenario to the current idea of being somewhere more akin to the Mediterranean. And building in resilience for all of those potential options is quite challenging, isn't it?
It is. But and I think the basic building blocks of resilience about species diversity so far as appropriate, structural diversity and complexity, getting on top of the deer, getting on top of those other threats where we do have some control, will put us in the best possible place. But yeah, it's a job.
No doubt about it. I think you're right. Reducing all the stresses that are within our control is what we should be doing, so that actually, there's some things that we can't deal with on a site manager basis, but if there are things that we can deal with, definitely. We've had a sort of like the opposite side of the coin about would you like to say something about invasive woody species? So that was I would.
I think in the book I mainly talk about the obvious ones like rhododendron and laurel, and that is a conservation priority to clear them out of ancient woods. They suppress the regeneration of tree species and they suppress woodland ground flora. So we've got I think that in decision-making terms, that's an easy one. In practical terms, it's a lot harder. But I mean, what I would say is that we've seen great progress in some places. On the government forest estate, amongst the ENGOs, there's been really good progress on the clearance of those species. But it's on the in private woods where we've got the real challenge on now, because it's a really hard work. The one species that's really exercising me at the moment, not to get on my hobby horse, is acacia, actually, which is one of those species that there is a lobby group that thinks we should be planting more of it because of its potential suitability to a future British climate, and that it does produce good timber. But in the oak woods in northern Spain and Portugal, as lots of you will know, it is highly invasive. And, you know, we're hearing about plantations of acacia planted in the rainforest zone in southwest England, and you just think this is crazy. So that's one I really worry about, actually. But that's a mess of our own making, potentially.
There's a really interesting question here, and I'll try and précis it if I can. But somebody in the USA that's very interested in English landscape and ancient trees, realizing my love of wilderness in the US has a separating effect of nature is separate from humans. Being here, one can walk along a footpath and come to a town or a church or a hedgerow or non-living ancient or lapsed pollard, and reinforces that we are, like Luke is saying, part of the woodland. I wanted to sort of pick up from a sort of personal capacity. I was very interested to read that a lot of your inspiration actually came from your links with America and your visits there. And I think I've always sort of looked to Europe and the inspiration that we're getting from there. So it was very interesting to read about your early experiences in the US. So I don't know whether there's any more you want to elaborate about that.
Yeah, no, well, yeah, I mean, that is the case. I mean, so for those of you who haven't read the book yet, and without wanting to spoil it, I don't think it's much of a twist. So when I was studying English and history, I went to America on academic exchange, and then went back to visit a friend of mine out there who was making a film about the battle to save the old growth redwoods. And it was a really formative experience for me. You know, it was the moment that made me realize that I shouldn't take the fact that I'd grown up in the woods, just playing in them and enjoying being in them, for granted, and that maybe I could make a job of this, really. And that also, you know, is so inspired about these people, you know, standing up for what they believed in, as I was a kind of budding environmentalist as well. So it was completely formative, really, and really set me on this path. And it was really interesting, actually, in writing the book, to have to think hard about that difference in American history from European history in terms of the human relationship with land, and to articulate that in a really careful way. Because, you know, before colonization, obviously there were a lot of people in America, but the population density was nothing like what it is, or was in Europe. So they didn't influence the land in quite the same way. But I really did want to be quite careful about getting that message across, that Native American people did manage the forests, but it wasn't anything like as intensive as coppicing and pollarding. And you know, I did have to be careful not to tell too simplistic a story about the wild American West, which, you know, isn't the case. But as ever, there was quite a number of times in writing this book where I got lost down a rabbit hole of nuance that I was having to explain carefully. Yeah, so anyway, there you go.
Yeah, I think the questions also bringing out maybe the difference. I haven't been to the US for very many years, but the difference in here, I guess, you know, in our cities we still have quite a lot of parks, so we do have nature around us and we do have trees around us. Maybe it's, you know, the English landscape is slightly more integrated within our within where we live on the whole, or maybe we don't necessarily think it is, but perhaps it is from seeing it from the other side. Yeah.
Really interesting. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's easy for me. So I look at from my shed. I've got a view of Sheffield, which I don't know for how many of you have been to Sheffield, but we are really lucky here, because it is, from this perspective, it looks more like a city in a wood than a city with a load of trees. You know, it's an extraordinary place, really. And yeah, we are the most wooded city in the UK. But, you know, there's that whole campaign to turn London into a national park, isn't it? The level in green cover in London is enormous. We are typically quite lucky in this country to be close to green space, actually. So yeah, interesting. Now, how that compares to other parts of the world, I'm not sure. So yeah, so again, interesting observation.
Thank you. I think we're sort of running it. There's various other comments in the chat and one or two links to information about climate change. So do all have a look at that. And a bit more of a discussion about natives and non-natives like sweet chestnut and the Celtic maple. But sadly, I think we're sort of running out of time for that. I just wanted say thank you very much, Luke. I think I'll pass back over to Richard to do the sort of formal thank you. But it's been really interesting talking to you and hearing you talk a bit more about your experience with the book. Just before I pass over to Richard, I've just got one other bit of news I wanted to flag up, which was that the proceedings of the conference that we held at Burnham Beeches last summer they're being printed. So there will be copies for sale from the Arboricultural Association website in the next couple of weeks. I haven't got an exact date, but if you keep an eye on that, we'll also put things out on social media so that we can let you all know when that's been published. So thanks very much, Luke, and I'll pass back over to
Thank
Richard.
you, Helen. Yeah.
Thank you both. Thank you. I can't think of two better people to have led that conversation. You, Luke, with your insight and your wonderful book, but the sheer knowledge and breadth of knowledge of Helen, being able to add value to both of that is fantastic. So thank you both. And if you haven't read the book, do so, because it is a stunning read without a doubt. So thank you. Thanks, Luke. Just a final few things from me then, as it were. So again, thank you all for attending tonight, and thank you again for your donations to help ATF do its vital work in working solely with Ancient and Veteran Trees. It's the only charity that does work solely on that, and your donations helps enormously to make that work happen. We're so close to that big give donation. So anything that you have given, we can double over the next couple of days whilst that ends. So thank you for those. One of the things I treasure is visiting our local groups and going out on their visits to various different woods and forests, and listening again to such amazing conversations about trees. So if you have a chance to go on one of our local group visits, then do so. We have them across the whole of the country, and hopefully after the summer conference in Motherwell, we may well have local groups in Scotland as well that you can attend. But I was at Hatfield Forest just recently, which was stunning. I've been to the London Plain in Ely, where we launched the East Anglian group, which was also a stunning day. So our local groups are well worth visiting. Keep an eye on the ATF website, because this webinar will go on to our YouTube channel. Our next set of recordings and our next set of webinars will also be on there. So thank you, and keep an eye on those, and enjoy the rest of your evening. And I let you go forth back to whatever wood is close to you. So thank you very much for attending. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you.